This is the Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. Welcome back, YouTube. All right, folks. Welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and this is episode 52 with Jarl Endres. I say that right?
Yep.
Endres.
Yep.
Welcome.
Yep. Thank you.
So, the audience will have by now heard the intro and a little bit about you, and we'll get into all that stuff here in a minute because we've got a lot to talk about. But I want to ask you the first question, which is the same question I ask everybody, and that is, what does the phrase Conversations with the Mind mean to you? That's the title of the podcast, and just kind of want to get your perspective, being you have a unique background.
Yeah. So I suppose what it means to me is...
Here, just speak up just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what, I think the mind is such like a dynamic thing, and the phrase conversations with the mind is very intuitive because we're constantly recreating and like reimagining new situations, new events, new ideas consistently. So I think that it's very interesting phrase. I think just in general, I think the mind is an extraordinary thing. So.
Okay. I want to pick that apart a little bit because it's an aspect to the question that I don't think any guest has brought up yet. And it's something that I've alluded to and talked about in the past, but again, never really gotten into. And this is that the human mind in particular, and our particular consciousness that we know of, it has this amazing ability to, like what you're describing, to simulate, right?
Exactly.
To simulate other realities that are potential, I can simulate what you're going to say next in the podcast and then do something proactively, right? Or I can think ahead to a possible future that is a total fantasy and could never exist, right? I don't know if we know that if animals can do that. I feel like animals are more like in the moment most of the time. I think maybe primitive dolphins or orcas might have some sort of ability like
Whales,
we do.
Yeah, in general.
But this idea of consciousness and the mind as like it's a very cool tool, like you said, to be able to simulate. Like there's so many applications for that and reasons why we're at the top of the food chain, right? Why we can do that.
Exactly. Yeah, I actually had a funny thing that I brought up when I was very stoned with one of my buddies, and it was so I asked my friend. I was like, I asked him for a superhero, and he named Hulk. And I said, does that exist? Is it in existence at all? And he said no. And I said, well, that's actually incorrect, because in your own mind you can picture the Hulk in with everything in your mind. You can visually recreate it inside your own subconscious mind. The picture of that's in your brain. And I said there's neurons in there that are characterized and dedicated only to remembering the Hulk and what it is. So that is on a basic level existence, and somehow, and it's like things like that the brain can do. It leaves
an imprint.
Yeah, exactly.
Somewhere on the neurons. And when you're describing that instance, like, so one set of neurons could be about remembering things about what you've seen, right, of the Hulk. Would a separate set of neurons, or would it be the same set of neurons that would be responsible for like simulating or imagining your conception of Hulk in any number of scenarios? So right, like I've seen the Hulk movies, I can picture the movie in my mind, but I can also close my eyes and I can picture Hulk grilling burgers by the side of the pool with a pink apron.
Exactly.
Right? Which has never happened in a movie. Never happened. Right? So is that linked to the remembrance, or is that a new creation of the mind? Right?
Exactly. See, so
pretty cool.
Very, very interesting topic, and I've been stuck on that one for a bit. It's like almost more philosophical than neuroscience based, but still, I think it just goes to show that the brain is a very, very powerful thing. And there's actually there was a neurosurgeon working out of like Belgium, I believe, and he was doing a brain surgery. I think it was like he's putting in a DBS system, maybe.
What's a DBS system?
Deep brain stimulator.
Oh, okay.
And actually, I don't know what it was. The patient was awake, and he was watching TV with Jennifer Aniston on the TV.
Okay.
And the neurosurgeon located a specific neuron that was fired only when the patient seen Jennifer Aniston.
Okay.
And so they dedicated it. You can look it up. It's called the Jennifer Aniston neuron. And so you could essentially say that there's neurons for literally everything that you've ever seen in your life.
So is that a standardized neuron? So that guy, they found the Jennifer Aniston neuron. If they look in the same exact part of my brain, are they going to see the same exact neuron in that location? Or does that even assume that I even have a Jennifer Aniston neuron? What if I've never even heard of her? I'm from the southern tip of Antarctica.
Yeah, so I think you'd have to be predisposed. You'd have to previously see something to have a neuron dedicated for it. But I think it just goes to show that neurons at the brain at its basic level, which is neurons, largely just interneurons and pyramidal cells, are just the most fascinating things in all of existence. They're just so dynamic.
They are, and I studied psychology, and now I'm getting more into I've been into quantum physics and cosmology and things like that for the last 5-10 years, and trying to interweave all these disciplines today to help me gain a deeper understanding than any one focus on any subject could. But when I think about neurons, I think about a lot of different things, and one of those things is obviously the science stuff, right? Like the structure of the neuron. But a lot of my other thoughts, which I want to get into as well. Maybe we'll just jump to that right away.
Yeah.
But so okay, how do I put this? Okay, so we have. Okay, so we're talking neuroscience. We're talking neurons and their ability to grow themselves, to store information. In a way, I've referred to them from a cosmological perspective, a neuron and the interactions there is a microcosm of what's happening out in the larger universe, right? Electrochemical signaling is similar between those. That could be possible communication between planets or whatever, right? So in a lot of ways, I've believed through all this integration of different concepts that the mind is sort of its own universe, right? And if we
I believe that as well.
If we want to learn more about the universe out there, all we have to do is look in here and study this a little bit more, because I don't know. To me, it seems common sense that they're of a fractal nature.
Yeah, definitely.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
In the last podcast, we talked about the fractal nature of nature and existence, but then I brought up the idea that maybe the mind itself could be fractal as well. What the implications for that could be.
I think that life itself is so beautiful, and when you say fractal, it makes me think of trees and their branches, and then if you take a look at the structure of lungs, they're branching. If you take a look at neurons, they're also branching. There's so many similarities.
Neurons look like mycelium beds.
Yeah, exactly.
Fungi.
Yeah, for fungus. Yeah, exactly. It's just there's so many similarities, but the DNA and all this other stuff is so vastly different, but they still come together similarly.
Okay. So given that, I'm glad that we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So you can see how I think that way.
Yeah.
Now, when I've looked into cosmology, right, they've taken microwave images of where we think the Big Bang originated from, and what we see is of the whole universe, it looks like this interconnected brain of energies, right? And that's what people would consider dark energy, dark mass, things like that. The stuff in between matter,
Yep.
right? And it looks like a brain. It looks like the connections in a brain.
It definitely does.
So we know that that's out there. We've shown it. So now I want to wind it back down to the mind fractal with neurons too. So if the neurons inside of our brain and the structure literally looks like the universe that we've observed out there, and we know that there's stuff in between the stuff out there, it would make sense that there's stuff in between the neurons inside. We know about chemical reactions between, nerve terminals, in between the synapses, things like that. We know about electrical signaling between axons and dendrites and things like that. We know about electrochemical interactions where they're interchanged. But do we know anything yet about the rest of the 98% of the space in between the neurons, in between the dendrites?
Yeah. So,
not just at the connections.
Yeah. I think that people always say that neuroscience is the last frontier in like science. You know, maybe physics would be a close second as well, just because there's so many things, black holes, all that other stuff that we don't really know too much about, and it's hard to study. And neuroscience is one of those things that is just inherently difficult to study. The brain itself is inherently very difficult to study. I mean, you can, name, for example, like schizophrenia. It's a completely idiopathic disorder, and people have been studying it for, decades now, and we haven't really came close at all to any sort of answer. And we should almost just take a step back and look at things from like a philosophical approach and try it and try to do it that way, and also use like relations such as like psychotropics and stuff like that, and how brains react.
What do you mean about a philosophical approach? What do you mean because I love philosophy, but I'm wondering, like, how do you take a philosophical approach to neuroscience?
Well, you just
or to at least guiding your direction of research.
Yeah, I don't know. It would be something like just really sitting down and thinking about the different ways that something could go wrong in brains, in neurons. This author and neuroscientist Sebastian Sung proposed the connectomics theory, which it's pretty much as philosophical. He's pretty much saying that it's not a problem with neurotransmitters, as a lot of people think. People think schizophrenia, for example, is dopamine driven. I fail to believe that as well. He says that it's more involved with how neurons are connected to each other that is causing the problems. So you have like a malignant line or a malignant like neural line of cells that are just inadequately connected to each other. And he says that his theory is that that's probably one of the problems with schizophrenia. And I think that has some merit to it, but I think it's a lot deeper than that. What I was going to tell you about consciousness, I think you're going to really love this. I think I read it somewhere in this book. So this book is called The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul by Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka. It was released in 2019 by MIT Press. And somewhere in here, there was a philosophical thing to consciousness, and they said it's consciousness is a mirage, essentially. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, wow, that is so very accurate to me, at least, because your brain is composed of so many different parts. They're very specialized cells that deal with certain things. You have like the hippocampus, you have the limbic system, basal ganglia, the cerebellum. All those different things play, way different roles. And the combination of all those creates a consciousness and, the human interactions. I thought that was very on point.
So why do they call it a mirage then?
Because we ourselves believe that we are sentient beings, but it's actually a mirage because it's just small components of things, all working towards together. But then you could also go and say that consciousness is vastly above that. You could say that it's like a very spiritual thing, which I also tend to believe, because there's just too many things in life that are very strange and happen in strange ways. So
yeah, and you get a certain feeling about certain circumstances.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of go beyond consciousness. So I want to back us up a little bit because there's a lot there. So first, when you're talking about the researcher,
Sebastian.
Yeah. So I also agree that, I believe that mental health issues, addiction issues, are not 100% entirely about chemical imbalances in the brain.
Yeah.
As most of the general public has been led to believe.
Yeah, that's what they think.
Right? With all of our advertising saying, just take this pill and it'll fix the chemical imbalance. I can't tell it. Like, I'm an addictions counselor here in town, and I can't tell you how many, probably 80 to 90% of my clients come to me and say, I have a chemical imbalance in my brain, that's why I'm depressed.
Yeah.
And I just want to shake them and be like, no!
Yeah.
Like that's a piece of it, but you can't blame it all on that. Consciousness is so much more
diverse,
complicated. And like you said, because of all these specialized parts working together. So that's one thing I want to put out there for the audience, that we need to stop blaming chemical imbalances and trying to fix things just chemically.
Yeah,
like
with neurotransmitters, etc.
So chemical interventions are helpful.
Yeah.
They're like tools.
Yeah.
Certain circumstances,
situations, definitely.
They call for a certain tool, like a psychedelic or something, right?
Exactly.
Perfect example of inserting a chemical molecule in order to bring about a certain experience.
Yeah.
But that being said, long-term fixes of mental health issues, we should not be focusing on just fixing the chemical imbalance, because from a psychological perspective, I'm a believer that a lot of our trauma informs mental illness, whether it's neglect, abuse, exposure to environmental toxins, exposure to circumstances, near-death events. All this stuff triggers these different parts of our brain, the different specialized parts, and tunes certain areas up to their own specific combination for every person based on their experiences. And so it manifests differently for everybody. And so we can't just treat the chemical like in a standardized fashion, because it doesn't work the same for everybody. We got to treat the trauma. We got to treat the conscious memory of the experience, help people reprocess the memory so that it's more facilitated for growth. So there's that piece. I think that's fascinating. I don't know anything about the malignant patterning, but it sounds a lot like behavior patterns that are ingrained in neurons.
The plasticity of neurons is widely studied now, and that's what I think therapy helps with.
Breaking those patterns and reforming new ones.
Reforming new connections, forgetting old things, stuff like that. I mean, they believe like memories are formed in surface proteins that are bound onto neurons.
So the memories are actually kind of downloaded and living in this database, which is just a fat capsule?
Yeah, pretty much like a protein aggregate.
Oh, protein capsules.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So just
like a storage system.
Yeah, things like that. But as you well know, like, you can forget something 100%, and you can't remember it anymore. But also there's those memories that stick with you forever and you'll never forget. And those ones are, let's say it's like a traumatizing thing that somebody cannot forget, and it's causing mental health issues, depression, anxiety, etc. Reshaping those is immensely difficult, but using our tools, such as like MDMA, LSD, those types, I think, coupled with therapy, it just makes for a very efficient way to deal with things, I believe. Also, ketamine is a big one people are using now, and I really like that. I think those are gonna be very prominent here in the coming months.
So I definitely want to pick that whole thing apart that you just said, but I want to leave that because it's gonna be like I have a lot of notes. I have a lot of questions for you on that. But first, just to kind of wrap up the point that you were making about this book too, and what these folks were saying about consciousness being a mirage, before we jump into this other stuff. So when you said that, initially, like, I felt this response of like defensiveness, like, no, I got to defend consciousness, like it's not just a mirage, like it's real, I'm experiencing it right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. It definitely has like a more deeper spiritual thing, but I think that the inherent biological constitute of consciousness is just a series of, compartmentalized neurons that come together and just create something absolutely fantastic. Like we said at the start of this podcast, the consciousness of the brain is such a just dynamic thing, and we can fabricate realities out of nothing. So there's more to it. So when I also get offended when people say that it's or people say all it is just an organ. It's way more than that.
So 2 things there. The first being that number one, this is a point that I think you and I might differ on, which is perfectly fine, because I welcome bringing all these things to the table. Because I believe that consciousness or mind are probably even 2 separate things as well. But maybe that consciousness is this higher thing that uses the mind as a tool in order to accomplish things. But I also believe that the mind and the brain are not the same. That the mind exists out here in this ethereal plane,
I agree.
but maybe uses the brain as like a tuning fork to filter filter stuff into this physical specimen so that it can accomplish the things that this larger consciousness wants.
Yeah.
Do we disagree on that? Or
no,
okay.
I agree. I definitely agree. I think, like I said, just the amount of things that the brain and the mind can do, I believe that they are separate. The brain is an organ. The mind is something way different. Like I said, it has a spiritual connotation to it.
So then, that leads me to the second point, which is the spiritual piece of me. So my first inclination was like, mirage? No, this thing is real. And then my second inclination that kicked in was like my Buddhist training that said, well, as a Buddhist, we believe that consciousness is merely a projection. It's an illusion in and of itself. Everything that we experience as consciousness perceived by this human organ, this flesh organ, is merely an illusion, right? We know that our eyes and our brain only take in, a mere morsel of information that's out in this space, and then our brain makes up the rest of it, right? So, I may know that what I'm touching is real or whatever it's perceived as real, but everything else outside of that could just be my brain projecting that, right? Exactly. So the Buddhists would say consciousness is an illusion. Illusion, I mean, a mirage is an illusion. So then my second feeling was like, oh yeah, this does make sense, but now these neuroscientists are seeing it from their own perspective, but they're saying the same thing that the Buddhists are.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're saying, that physically it has no real, manifestation you could put your finger on. And say, exactly. This is where consciousness is in the brain.
Yeah. I don't believe there's any point. I actually searched for that quite long in one...
Search for what?
The origin point of consciousness in the brain. And there is no real thing. I mean, the only thing that I can think of, which is an area of the brain that I study a lot, it's called the reticular activating system. It's in the midbrain, and it is responsible for controlling your sleep and wake, not necessarily the circadian rhythm, but pretty much just your consciousness. So
it's like the on-off switch,
on-off
not
switch.
Necessarily the cycle or the timer.
Yeah, exactly. And I am fascinated with comas. I was actually in a coma from a drug overdose when I was
shit.
Yeah, when I was younger.
Accidental or?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, sort of. Anyways, after that, I became very interested in just how it works and helping people who are in mechanically induced comas, so people who are in car accidents and stuff like that, and the doctors say, oh well, I don't know when they're gonna wake up,
or when doctors have to say they're in so much pain that I have to put them in a coma, or they're gonna die from the shock or whatever. So then they induce a coma with drugs.
Medically induced a coma,
But does consciousness go away, right? So those are the questions that are driving you.
Exactly.
Cool.
But so actually my research project that I'm working on with Dr. Biosted, he's hosting me in his lab, which is very nice. I'm studying a plant called Callias akitachichi. It's called bitter grass. Callias akitachichi. Callias akitachichi, I believe.
It's a beautiful name.
Yeah, I think it's the scientific is Kellia turnifoil. But I became interested in this because it was called the dream herb. So the Krontal Indians used it to have like vivid lucid dreams and stuff like that. And when I was younger, I was fascinated with dreaming and stuff like that. And when I took it, and also I did a lot of research on Arrowhead forms, and everyone has the same exact reaction. You just have a very shitty night of sleep, and you wake up in like intervals of 15 minutes. So it is my personal belief that there is something in that plant that is some sort of allosteric modulator for the RAS system, because if you take something and it wakes you up in intervals, there must be some neurotransmitter activity, or like allosteric modulators, which are just they're like receptor sites on a receptor that help modulate receptor activity.
So you're kind of searching for a drug within, or a chemical compound within this particular plant that could lead you in the direction of that on-off switch within the brain.
For patients who are in a coma.
Right, so then you could, if you can identify that and then maybe learn how to stimulate it or flip it on or off, then you could theoretically go inside the brain physically of a coma patient, flip the switch and turn it back on.
Yeah, exactly.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so that is my goal, because I believe that people who are in a coma, their bodies are still fine. There's just, unless they have massive trauma to the brainstem, then they can still be rehabilitated. Like, so that's my protocol going into my master's, and my PhD will probably just be working on coma patients. But I think it's such a shame. So I worked in neurology when I was younger, and the doctor, he was a medical director for neurology in Alaska, and he told me that they do not do fMRIs or anything like that for coma patients to check if there's activity. They do EEGs, but it's not very good necessarily to measure the brain's activity like you'd want like a fMRI or a PET scan. That would be the most like diagnostic way to find out if somebody is...
Right, it's like using a magnifying glass versus using a high-powered telescope.
Exactly, yeah. But I think it's such a shame. So when people are in a coma, like if your loved one's in a coma, wouldn't you want to know if there's a...
If they're in a vegetative state, or if they're in like a dreamlike state.
Yeah, or if there's a possibility of getting them back and then getting them into rehabilitation. They could do physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and be back to normal. I mean, no one is going to be doing any good if they're just in a sleeping state.
Right.
So, and I think it's just such a shame, because there's thousands of people that are in a coma, and they just sit in a hospital and waste away. So,
that's fascinating. It's interesting how our past kind of is informing our current desire to pursue what we're individually pursuing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I had no idea that you were in a coma at a young age, and that's a direct link to probably why you're wanting to study comas.
Oh yeah,
right?
exactly.
For me, and mine's linked to drugs too. Mine is linked to my first ever drug experience when I was 16, taking LSD, before nicotine or anything, or alcohol, and it blew my mind wide open. And from that point on, I had to know more about consciousness. And that's forever driven my interest in psychology, and both my bachelor's and my master's, and now my PhD going forward in social work and studying psychedelics and consciousness and the podcast and everything. It's crazy how our past, and also so-called drugs has affected us in a way that we're now wanting to contribute to society in like these massive ways, right? That most people don't even want to undertake. Like, most people view drugs, and again I'm using air quotes here, as like illicit drugs that are going to ruin your life, and like, even if you smoke weed, you're going to be a stoner or lazy stoner on the couch, right? But not just us, but other people are proving every single day that that's not the case.
Yeah,
That's all propaganda and bullshit.
Exactly.
Like, these drugs are here for a reason, and a lot of the plant medicines in particular, I believe, are here with their own consciousness, trying to communicate with humans and animals and whoever chooses to ingest them. They're communicating to us neurochemically. They're communicating to us. I've read studies about people walking through the redwood forest, and scientists have now studied the air in the redwood forest, showing that they're releasing neurochemicals into the air, and the neurochemicals only have receptor sites within the human brain. Nothing else on the planet has these neurochemical receptor sites, and so the trees are literally trying to communicate in their own language to the humans. Right? So all this crazy stuff is all led from quote-unquote drug use, right?
Earth itself is just a giant symbiotic relationship with every different thing. One of my biggest fascinations is how a fungus, such as psilocybin cubensis, how a random fungus makes the same exact chemical analog as serotonin. Psilocybin or psilocin, when it gets cleaved in the gut, turns into serotonin. It's just amazing.
And how DMT is like a base structure for a lot of these chemicals, and it's found endogenously within us too.
Yep, exactly. I just think that's absolutely fascinating.
It shows us that we're part of this larger system.
Exactly.
We're not separate from, and I think that's a big part of the illusion that a lot of our species is unfortunately living under, is we think we're separate from our environment. We think we're separate from the earth. We think we're here to dominate and rule and master the earth.
That's what I absolutely hate about humans, is they're so very selfish, and they think that a human life is has more worth than, let's say, an insect's life. I think everything has a right to live, and I used to be a big hunter, and now I kind of feel bad about the things that I've done, just killed, but we did eat it, it was for meat, but
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I've never hunted, but I've always wanted to, but only for those reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
Never as like a sport.
Yeah, and I really am against like trophy hunting and stuff like that. I think it's just it's like literally killing something just for the sport of it.
And even on a deeper level, it's like killing yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Like if we're all part of this one large organism, you're killing this other part of you for sport.
Yeah, J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter series, she said that if you kill someone, it splits your soul. That's how Voldemort made all those Horcruxes and stored his soul. You got to kill someone in order to do that. But I thought that was fascinating.
Some metaphorical truth under there.
It is. Yeah, she's a smart lady.
It's fascinating, though. Just the idea of consciousness in general, I think, is fascinating. But I wanted to have you on specifically because of your interest in neuroscience. So if we divert back to consciousness, that's fine. But so before, you had mentioned some of your interests in neuroscience, and particularly, again, I come from a psychology perspective. I've studied some neuroscience as it relates to mental health issues. And I've heard some buzzword terms out there. I just want to get your sense on what some of these things are. So first and foremost, my interest in neuroscience from a psychological perspective, because I have a background in human performance and human optimization, I want to study things like neuroprogramming, right? How do we take this human biocomputer and reprogram it to function more optimally? Or how do we, and then stay with me. So there's, and then we have a couple ways to facilitate that currently. Things that I've heard of, neuro-linguistic programming. I want to hear your opinion on that. Neurofeedback, biofeedback, and then more classic again with air quotes, forms of neurobioprogramming, things like meditation, mindfulness, ancient practice through like contemplation, exploration of mental patterns, more of these classic ways that I tend to like to teach just because I think they're accessible by everybody. What is your take on those methodologies and how they fit into the future of like how we can reprogram our brain at the neuronal level.
So, I guess my answer to that, in terms of neuroprogramming, I honestly think one of the best examples would be speech therapists. I mean, you can see it after post CVA patients. For those of you who don't know that, that's cerebrovascular accident, so like a stroke, hemorrhage. So if you have damage to your Broca's area, those neurons can actually be rewired. You don't necessarily need that chunk. It looks like a W on the left side of your brain, and I think it's the inferior frontal gyrus. Brodmann's area 49 as well. It's very interesting because a patient can have a stroke and damage the Broca's area, not be able to speak. They go to speech therapy and then they regain their speech. I think that is one of the best examples of neuroprogramming because they help rewire those neurons and get speech function back again, which is...
Yeah, it's almost like if you took out a chunk of the brain and there's like this empty space, then the person could, through whatever, I don't know what techniques they use, but whatever technique they use, it's like you form a new pathway around this empty space, using its neighboring cells.
Yeah, so neurons have what's called growth cones. They're these little protein structures that kind of reach out when a neuron is... I think there's genes that control when it needs to make new connections, and they're called growth cones, and they just go and find a suitable mate and make a connection there, and I think that's just how. There's also a lot of neuroglial facilitation, such as astrocytes and microglia that clean up all the debris from past synapses that are no longer needed.
But it's interesting because while all that's going on at a structural level, the DNA is telling the neuron, like, okay, we need to branch out. This area is damaged. Go this way. Go do that. Very pragmatic stuff. There's also got to be like a higher order executive functioning going on that's determining, okay, if we have to take these alternate routes to rewire the speech patterns, are we going to have to rewrite over a neuron that's being used for something important? It's sort of like the old VHS tapes. Like if you record over them over and over, it degrades the quality.
Yeah.
Does that happen with neurons too, where only a certain amount of information can occupy one space?
Neuron. So that is a very enlightening question, but I must say that I have no clue, and I don't think honestly anyone really has a clue about how neurons know what to do. I know that there's genetic signaling pathways. You have
these are more like survival pathways, right?
Yeah, essentially that tell them to do certain things or upkeep certain neurotransmitters. Create like if it needs more dopamine, they take levodopa and then convert it to dopamine. But in terms of like what we were talking about with the Broca's area, somebody has a stroke, rewiring all that stuff to get speech function back, I really do not think anyone really has the answer to that yet.
But it's cool that we can do it.
Yeah.
Even if we don't know how we can do it,
but
it's freaking cool
happens.
That we can do it.
Yeah, it happens. But I also think that like I said previously, speech therapy, plays a big integrative role in reprogramming and like neurohacking, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, I love all those buzzword terms: neurohacking, biohacking, life hacking, things like that. Okay, so that's and again, I don't know what specific therapy speech pathologists use to do that, but let's jump to neurolinguistics. Right? What do you know about that?
So what do you mean by neurolinguistics?
Well, it's a buzzword term. Let me Google it real quick, just so we can get
linguistic programming.
So the internet, all-knowing internet says the branch of linguistics dealing with the relationship between language and the structure and functioning of the brain. So I think there's these brain maps here that show that certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain systems of language.
Yeah.
I'm having a tough time reading them. But
so I know that this that purple one in the very front there, that is not the orange one, my mistake.
The prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, so that actually right there.
Oh, this little section.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, so it's kind of like a W.
Interior, speech, and Broca's.
Yep,
Okay,
that is Broca's area, and then right.
So it's
here,
like right where your above, right where your temple would be.
Yep, and then
Okay.
right here is Wernicke's area, and then there is a connection that goes in between the two. Wernicke's is for speech comprehension.
Okay.
And Broca's is the motor function of speech. And there is a neural network that connects in between those two. So if you have Wernicke's aphasia, which can be caused by a CVA or a tumor or something like that, you can speak 100%. It's called fluent aphasia, so you can speak 100%, but the words that come out make absolutely no sense. It's actually very interesting to.
And the person believes that they're making sense.
Some people know that they're like, what did I just say? That is not correct. And then there's also non-fluent aphasia, which is Broca's aphasia, which you usually just stutter and then cannot say anything. So the motor function is completely gone.
Wow.
And then Wernicke's, if you want to pull up Wernicke's aphasia so you can see
Is that
it.
spelled with a W?
Yep.
Okay.
Wernicke's aphasia.
There it is.
It is
Also known as receptive aphasia, sensory aphasia, and posterior aphasia is a type of aphasia in which individuals have difficulty understanding written and spoken language.
Very.
Okay. That's kind of general because dyslexia and stuff fit into that, that kind of
Yeah,
classification.
if you want to click videos and hear it, it's absolutely fascinating to hear.
Okay.
Fluent aphasia right there.
Yeah, I don't know if I can play this on the podcast.
Oh, okay.
Because YouTube won't let me, but
Okay.
But I'll look this up when we're done with this.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Nice.
But yeah, I think sort of in terms of neurolinguistics, I think I'm not too well versed on the connections in between Wernicke's and Broca's area, but I know that it is a very dynamic part of the brain because a lot of people say that the only thing that separates humans from other animals is our ability to process language and stuff like that. So,
from what I picked up, and my understanding of neurolinguistic programming is limited. That's why I was asking you. Is that it's this idea in psychology that we can rewire the neurons in our brain simply by changing the language or the story that we tell ourselves about something. So say a trauma response is wired in the brain in a certain pattern through the neurons, right? When you receive a certain stimulus. Well, if someone wants to overcome that, they can come to therapy, we can explore that, and we can learn what sort of trigger words, trigger phrases people are telling themselves when they have that memory or that trigger, and it may trigger a flood of things that cause anxiety and whatever, a manic episode. So you figure out what that kind of stuff is, and then you change the wording a little bit, or you change it from a negative to a positive or something, and then through repetition and reprogramming on the patient's part, they can break those old connections. It takes a long time. Those roots are usually running pretty deep.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
So you gotta break that connection and then start a new path, and that takes a lot of repetition before you can wear that new path. So that's and I apologize to any listeners out there that can correct me. Please let me know. I want to be informed. But so what about like neurofeedback and things like that?
So this is another one that I don't have too much expertise in. So I mainly just do cellular and molecular neuroscience, not really cognitive behavioral.
Yeah, okay. No, that's a good point. I'm asking you maybe a little bit. So my interest in future, possibly a dissertation, is a mix between ketamine-assisted therapies and neurofeedback. So Dr. Scott Shannon over at the Wholeness Center is finding in the literature and is also starting his own research into this area in ketamine-assisted therapy, showing that he's pointed out these studies that show that ketamine in and of itself as a molecule helps facilitate greater learning in the brain. Whether it's in the brain or in consciousness, we don't know yet. I think in the brain is what they're showing. But people's recall and things like that are better and improved. And so he wants to study how can we improve learning of the human species through chemical intervention, through psychedelic expansion. But he uses neurofeedback tools. So most neurofeedback setups, you're sitting in front of a computer with the EEG on your head, and there's certain features on the computer, whatever program it's going to be. Ones that I've used are like, there'll be like a balloon on the screen, and it's programmed to respond to a certain area of the brain that is linked with anger, right? So then you can make the balloon on the screen move up by activating a certain area of your brain, right? So by practicing focusing on that, focusing on the emotions, focusing on the memories, focusing on thoughts of whatever emotion you're trying to control, you can make this thing on the screen move, right? So with repetition, you are becoming more familiar with controlling these parts of the brain. And so with time, people can, in sports psychology, we use biofeedback, which is kind of similar in that...
it's like controlling resting heart rate.
Arousal states, things like that. So you can control, your heart rate, lowering your heart rate just by thinking it, monks have been shown to be able to manipulate their metabolism just by using their mind. So we know that we have these kind of links, and I think part of the future of psychology and also neuroscience, both together, is going to be this neurofeedback, this human-machine interface in order to gather more information about ourselves.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have very little experience in neurofeedback, but from what I can tell, the people that do it at clinics, I don't necessarily think it is a useful tool, just because I know that they only use like 4 or 5 leads in EEG. We're usually in EEG.
It's not very sensitive.
Yeah, exactly. So if it was more precise, I think it would be useful, but they just need better equipment for it, because I've seen a couple setups and it did not look impressive at all.
Yeah, it's brand new. Oh, not brand new. Only a couple decades old, maybe, technology. But the way technology is going now, like in the way cell phones have taken off and increased exponentially every year, I think if there's more of a focus on this kind of technology, we can probably start to do that. I know with some brain surgery techniques, they'll keep patients awake and be stimulating things like in their brain with open head surgery and like asking them questions while they're doing this, and that's nuts to me.
Yeah, that's how they found the Jennifer Aniston neuron.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, so stuff like that.
I mean, we've gone from like crude lobotomies and removing whole chunks of the brain to now like intricate neurosurgery, open head while they're awake.
There's a thing when I was like 14, I think. They created, it's called a high intensity focused ultrasound, and it's an ultrasound machine that can, so they had a block of silicon, like a silica gel, and inside they had like a little piece of whatever, and they took the machine and were able to make a burn on the inside on that little piece, and it didn't affect any of the silica. It uses sound waves, and I thought that was very, very interesting, because then you could do neurosurgery without even having to go do like a craniotomy.
Yeah, I think on a few podcasts ago, I talked about the potential of maybe using sound technologies like that, because each organ in the body resonates at a different frequency. So if you have like a liver cancer, well, find the frequency of the person's liver, target your intervention at that frequency, and then you won't affect the other organs around it.
Exactly.
We're already doing stuff like that with kidney stones and ultrasounds and stuff, and breaking pieces up.
What are they called?
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.